Behind the Roar, the official podcast of West Tigers.
Well, welcome to a very special edition of Behind the Roar, the official podcast of West Tigers. It is episode 7. It's where we kick speculation into touch. It's where we give it to you straight and where we learn more about the people and the stories behind this great club. This week's guest holds a special place in the history of this club as a former coach of Western Suburbs Magpies and one of the nearest and dearest to the late, great Tommy Raudonikis, who this week passed away 2 years ago. He's a rugby league icon, our guest, who coached the Magpies between 1978 and 1981. He was Dally M Coach of the Year in 1980 and also 1985. And after putting the coach's clipboard in the cupboard, so to speak, he forged a long and very successful career in journalism, reporting on his great love, rugby league, but also on, well, pretty much anything else happening in the world around him. It is an honour, it is a privilege to welcome Roy Masters to Behind the Roy.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm delighted to be here, especially as you've just taken me on a tour of these very, very splendid headquarters of the joint venture. I see saunas, I see lap pools, I see steam rooms, I see audio-visual rooms, gymnasium, wrestling mats. It's an incredible facilities, and congratulations to the club.
A little bit different to way back when, huh?
Magnificently. In fact, at Western's at Lidcombe Oval, when it rained, we had to go to other facilities. We had to jump in cars and drive around. Sometimes we'd do ball work under the sheds at the Flemington markets.
Well, there you go. And you're going out for lunch later on.
Yeah.
I understand too, out that way. You're in Melbourne. You've been down there for quite some time now. So thanks very much for jumping on the plane and coming up to visit us here. And I know you've bumped into some familiar faces already. You're looking really, really well. You had the knees done a couple of years ago, huh?
I did in 2021. I had the left knee done, and then 5 months later the right knee, and I was a victim of lockdown down there. You just couldn't move. And so consequently I thought I've got to get some value out of this. You're only allowed out an hour a day. So I thought if I'm going to be locked in a house, I might as well be locked in a hospital. But it was inevitable. I just had to have the operation, and I'd had also a bad case of what is called Ross River fever.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, where a mosquito bites you and it invades all your joints. And I was incredibly arthritic. Could hardly move. And since then, I've been out and about, and even just this last week, I was trekking in the mountains to the west of Victoria on the border with South Australia, called the Grampian Mountains, with John Singleton and Johnny Quayle.
Wow.
And Jack Cowan, the bloke who owns Hungry Jack's franchise. And, of course, it wouldn't be a trek without bringing along a couple of his Newtown mates, which were Cole Murphy and Phil Sigsworth. But we had 6 days of very solid trekking, and the knees held up really well.
Well done. You talk about Newtown. We talk about Tommy Raudonikis. We're going to be chatting and remembering and reflecting on some of the great times that you had with Tommy a little bit later on. And that's one of the reasons that I invited you and wanted you to come up this week. So I'm really, really happy that you're here, mate, in a special week for Tommy and his family and friends and this club. Just on the West Tigers this year, and we know it's been a really difficult start to the season. None of us expected to be 0-5. A tough loss at the weekend in Brisbane, but that is the way it is. As a coach, did you go through some lean patches yourself?
No, I don't think I never started the season 05 or even 03 or even 02 for that matter. Even in 1980 when we lost all those players, we lost Boyd Brown and Diary to Manly, we lost Tommy and Graham O'Grady to Newtown. Even then I think we started something like 3-0, but what I believe any turnaround in a club, and you've been a player, the big turnaround comes through defence. So if any coach comes to a club and he wants to turn around things quickly, or Tim with all his vast experience knows that it's getting the players to getting your defence right is the quickest way to turn things around.
Well, let's hope it comes on Easter Monday. That's the next challenge for the team and the club. That should be a great day out there at a core stadium, free entry for the kids and all sorts of things happening. We'll chat more about that a little bit later on as well. Well, Roy, this is how it works. I don't suppose you've had a chance to listen to the first 6 episodes of Behind the Roar. It is a new series here. We open with a set of 6, okay? So we're going to get to know a bit more about you. In the middle of the podcast, we're going to be, again, reflecting and talking about some of those yarns about Tommy. Some we can talk about, some we probably can't talk about. We'll have a few questions from the crowd as well. And then the back end, when there's about 5 left on the clock, we'll throw a rapid fire, quick 5 at you. It's about some of your favourite times and moments and memories. So there is the whistle. So here's the first tackle on the opening set of 6. Take us right back, Roy. Your upbringing, where was home as a kid? Big family?
Big family. I'm the eldest of 7. Father was a primary school teacher, and so we moved around the north coast of New South Wales, essentially. Wherever my father went with the stick of chalk, I went with him. So I grew up in that area, the north coast, and of course rugby league's the big game up there. My father, nonetheless, came from a very strong soccer background. His father, and therefore my grandfather, and also my great uncle, were in the Australian soccer team. In fact, the captain of the Australian soccer team was Judy Masters, who was recently been inducted into Soccer Hall of Fame. He was captain of Australia for many years, all through the 1920s, veteran of Gallipoli. But soccer was not the game played on the north coast of New South Wales. Rugby league was, and you always want to play where your mates are. And I wanted to play rugby league, so that's what we did. But coming from those little small primary schools where Dad was a teacher, such as a little place by the name of Urbanville, you had to take the 6-stone or the 5-stone 7 team, which we were in. Consisted of kids all the way down to bloody second class, in order to get 13 players on the field. In fact, I can remember I was up at a State of Origin game once. You wouldn't remember him, but some of our listeners might. A very fiery fellow by the name of John Payne. He played up in Queensland and played. He didn't actually play for Australia. He was selected for Australia and sat on the bench for Australia, but he never quite got on the field. He was a very fiery prop. But in that Urbanville Primary School 5-stone 7 team that went down to the casino knockout, there was me in 6th class and Tiger Payne there in about 3rd class. And we had to play the big boys, of course, and they walloped us.
How things have changed. What position were you?
I was a hooker.
Yeah.
Although way back then I was a lock, but in primary school.
Any good?
No, not much good at all, mate. Because I became, after playing rugby union at university, I then began as school teacher at a very strong rugby league school called Tamworth High School.
Yep.
And because when you're a school teacher, there's a male one anyway, you're an obligation on you to take a football team. Yes. And so I did. And I quickly learned, Chris, that I was a far better coach than a player. So I surrendered that and spent the time coaching these kids. And Tamworth High, of course, went on and won multiple university shields and state knockouts. And it was a great education for me, which, of course, led in turn to me being selected as the coach of the Australian schoolboys team that went to England, which in 1972 was undefeated on that tour. And which did produce some great players, some of whom, or many of whom, joined me later in the Sydney first grade team. I refer to Les Boyd. He was in that team. So Craig Young, who I coached also at St George. Yeah. In that team also was Ian Schubert, who I coached at Western Suburbs here, along with Les Boyd.
Big names you're throwing out.
And another player who was captain of the team was Royce Ayliffe, who was captain of the Roosters at one stage. And so they were 4 players that came out of that Australian schoolboys team, including Robert Finch, for example, who played for premiership player with St George. Jack Jeffries, who played here with Wests, and then followed me over to St George when I went there. So it was a very, very good team. And then from that, of course, I came to Sydney.
I was going to ask what was the pathway through to coaching first grade, and you've just pretty much given it there. So it was back through your association at Tamworth and then with the Australian Schoolboys. So we've got an affiliation with Tamworth, and we've been there for the last few years, and we're going there again, taking a home game to Tamworth. So we've got quite a following in that region, and it's a great part of the world. After your coaching, Roy, then you experienced a very successful career in journalism. How did that happen?
Well, when I was coaching Wests around about 1980, there was an afternoon newspaper battle going on between the Sun newspaper and the Mirror. The Sun newspaper had a strong foothold in the southern and eastern suburbs, whereas the Mirror basically had a stranglehold on the west and the north, particularly the inner west, Parramatta, Penrith, that area where the Mirror was very strong. So the Sun newspaper people decided that why don't we form an identity with Western Suburbs League Club? They formed one with Parramatta too. But of the two clubs, I was asked to write a column, a Friday column for the Sun newspaper. The idea was to attract readers from away from the Mirror towards the Sun, and so consequently, I wrote those columns, and then in the summertime they thought, well, you're not too bad at this, so they got me to write cricket and other summer sports, and then even when elections started, to dip my nose into writing about political campaigns. And of course, I'd been to university, so I had a degree in economics, etc. So I was even branched out into finance a little bit. So that was basically again through rugby league, and then in the Sun. And then when the Sun finally folded as a result of afternoon newspapers no longer being profitable, then I moved to the Sydney Morning Herald.
Oh, you have a way with words, and I remember reading your columns many times, and so different to other journos, and so poetic and creative, and some of it went over my head, I'll be honest, but I always enjoyed the approach that you brought to sport. I didn't read the politics pages. It wasn't for me. Tommy Raudonikis, we're going to talk more about him a bit later on, as I said that. What was it about Tommy that made him such a popular character?
Well, he's always, the rank and file people have always identified with him. The working class people, they see him as one of them, and they feel as though he's going to treat them equally, as though he's never going to look down on them. But if a peculiar thing has happened in Australian life since the days when he was a player, I believe that there's this I was talking to Singo about this on our trip through the Grampians. There's a polarisation taking place in Australian society where you've got people on the right and people on the left. Now, the people on the right believe very, very strongly in free speech, and they hate political correctness. Well, that's Tommy. He hated political correctness, and he worshipped free speech, and his long-time partner, Trish, would say to him, "You can't say that, Tommy." And he'd said, "But it's true. Can't I say it? It's true, so therefore I'm going to say it." But at the same time, the people on the left who sort of like to support people who are disadvantaged, people who are struggling, people who are in trouble, they identify him because they can see Tommy as a man of the left as well. So in an increasing polarised Australia, he is accepted, was worshipped by both sides. He began as a migrant, the son of a migrant family in Cowra. Father was Lithuanian, mother was Swiss. So number of kids in the family, so many that they had to farm him out for a year. The local police sergeant in Cowra took him on to look after him. And I remember he turned up at the policeman's house with a shoebox, and all he said is, "All I've got is a pair of sand shoes and 2 shillings." That's all he had. And the policeman looked after him. And then he became, he got selected in the New South Wales primary school team to play Queensland as a second rower, I think. Yeah. And then, of course, rugby league gave him an opportunity to throw away the disadvantages of being a relocated child of a migrant family.
You're living in Melbourne, as I say, these days, and you have been for some time. What's a typical day look like for you now?
Well, I have a close association with the Storm these days. I'm a great person in favour of rugby league expanding out of New South Wales and Queensland. I don't want it to be just a 2-state game. I want it to be a 3-state or 4-state game. So I go down to the Storm perhaps once a week. But I also, my wife and I have 10 grandchildren, 8 of whom live in Melbourne.
Keep you busy.
So I spend a lot of time with them, taking them to the swimming pool or taking them to preschool. And then I like to walk around in the park and get about 10,000 steps in. So, and then I like to sit down sometimes in the afternoon and help start a column. It might take me a couple of days slowly to write a column, something that strikes me, and like to end the day as I have for the last 60 years with a couple of beers.
Nice. We might chat about Craig Bellamy a bit later on because I know you're quite tight with him. Away from sport and writing, what are some of your other pastimes? And where did the love of writing come from?
Well, the love of writing really came from my mother. My mother, Olga Masters, was one of Australia's foremost writers. She didn't begin writing until she was in her mid-50s, and she published 5 books, all of which have been highly regarded. She is a sort of a hero of many female writers. She wasn't a feminist, but many people see her as an early feminist in the sense that she was forging a path. She didn't begin writing until basically the last of the children left home. She once said that my books, my children are my books. But some of her work is highly regarded, such as The Home Girls, Loving Daughters, Amy's Children. These are highly regarded titles in Australian literature. So it was from her that I got that love of words, essentially. And in fact, all my brothers and sisters have followed in a similar path. Me being the eldest son of a school teacher, I was basically had to take the the public service path and go off and get your degree at university, son, before you can do anything else. But all the others, they were able to take more adventurous paths. And so I've got the second eldest brother, Ian. He's living in Los Angeles. He's has his own radio show over there. My brother Quentin now lives in Spain. He was a very prominent film producer, made some great movies, and starring Joan Collins.
Yeah, wow.
And then there was the next. Then there's Chris Masters, the famous Four Corners journalist, whose works have led to about 3 royal commissions in different states, and currently involved in the big Ben Robert Smith defamation case at the moment. Sister Sue was executive producer of Australian Story.
Wow, it's a very successful family, all coming out of a little country type town in
Urbanville,
North Coast.
yeah.
So population of
about 200.
200. Half of the Masters.
Yeah.
Roy, that's the set of 6. That's the opening set of 6. This could be a long game. We might go into extra time here.
Bryden's lawyers are the lawyers you know and trust. If you require legal representation, then why look anywhere else? Call Bryden's lawyers on 1800 848 848. Bryden's lawyers, we do support you in your time of need.
Let's talk some serious stuff. We're going to talk more about Tommy. Before we do that, let's go way back to those days at the Magpies when you were the head coach, 1978. You were there for 4 years. You had Tommy and some other very larger-than-life characters, Dallas Donnelly, Joe
Boyd,
Cool, Les Boyd, and others.
Snake O'Grady.
Some big names, some big personalities. Firstly, with Dallas Donnelly, and I saw you on Matty John's podcast not that long ago, and I think you were trying to equate what Dallas might earn if he was in the modern game today. What type of a player was he?
Well, Dallas was a traditional front row forward, and round about that time, I reckon the front row was probably pretty close to the most important person on the field. The halfback was coming into being as the most important person. I now believe the fullback's the most important person on the field. With left and right defences, the fullback is the one that often makes the difference. But it was around about that time, for example, if you're retired as a player and you wanted to go and still continue on in the bush, the bush clubs were all wanting front row forwards. So it was a 5 metre rule, take the ball up, a lot of toughness was required. Scrums had to be competitive, and Dallas, I'd known Dallas as a schoolboy. In fact, I'd coached him in the schoolboy teams because he was at Gunnedah and I was at Tamworth, and they were only 48 miles different. Yeah. But he was also a champion swimmer as a kid. And he was also he was a 5'8" at school, but he certainly grew very quickly. And I saw him kick a field goal once right in front of me, and he was pretty talented for a big prop. He had good distribution skills. Took the ball up. Look, he played for Australia. He could have been a better player if I could have kept him off the syrup.
Like the syrup.
He just loved the syrup. And he suffered from epilepsy too, which meant, of course, that he would have a seizure every now and again, particularly if he'd forgotten to take his tablets. And that's, of course, what killed him in the end. He drowned in the surf at Byron Bay.
Talk us, Les Boyd, you had a particularly strong bond with Les.
Yeah, well, I loved Les Boyd and still do, and he would call me once a week. And I had him, as I said earlier, on the Australian schoolboys trip. I brought him to West's. I saw him do things on a field that I've never seen other people do since. I saw him chase down Russell Fairfax once. Russell Fairfax was going to score a try. There was nothing more certain. But somehow he just almost as though he dropped from the sky, landed behind him, picked him up and dropped him down on a sixpence. I mean, it was a phenomenal player.
Joe Cool, just a natural talent.
Just a natural talent, speed. You wouldn't think he was running fast, but he was getting close, carrying the ball. He was getting further and further away from everybody. He had a beautiful, satiny stride.
You win the minor premiership in your first year at Western Suburbs, 78. And then you bow out in straight sets. I think it was the Sharks and Manly. What went wrong?
Well, I think basically that we overachieved, that we had been playing pretty much on top gear the whole season, that these other sides such as Cronulla and Manly, they had 2 or 3 more gears to move up once they got to the semi-finals. Plus, I don't think, looking back, we handled it really well. We had a week off after winning the minor premiership, probably spent too much time on the syrup. And and of course, we hadn't never played at the SCG. We'd never been there before. So that was a bit of a shock to us. But there was also a referee around at the time that your father might know a little bit about, Hollywood Hartley. And to this day, Graham O'Grady, in that final against Manly, he kicked the ball, went high in the air, regathered it, put it down over the line. And Hartley said, "You're offside." He said, "But how can I be offside? I kicked the ball." You're offside. I mean, that whole game turned on that.
Well, we had no bunker back then,
No.
did we? Okay, we have to talk about the face slapping incident, and that's an iconic piece of vision that still gets played today. And I know you, out of that, became almost defined as the great master motivator. Give us the backstory to that, though, Roy. How did that all come about?
Well, it was 1979, and the 60 Minutes had approached us to follow us around, and they conned us a little bit. They sort of said that you can't be doing this well unless you're on drugs.
Okay.
And we were incensed by that. The only drug we were on was life. And winning, and so we gave them entree to everything, and it was a day where we were playing a team pretty much down the ladder, and sometimes when players, it was a cold, windy, wet day. It was
at Lidcombe?
Lidcombe Oval. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the players came into training and they were dressed up in the big, Ugg boots and rain and Canadian jackets in those days, and I could see they didn't want to play football. There was no way in the world that they had their mind. They wanted to be home watching bloody TV in front of a fire. So we had a mad trainer at the time, a fellow by the name of Dave Dickman. I said, these guys aren't ready to play. Get them going, Dave.
Sort him out.
So he divided them up. He came from the martial arts. He was a very good trainer, but very hard. And he divided them up into pairs. And he said, okay, start slapping each other's faces. Well, away they went. And two players, I can't remember. Certainly Ray Brown was one of them. I've forgotten who the other one was. It could have been Les Boyd. They really got into a stink with each other there in the dressing room, and I had to actually pull them apart.
Tommy seemed to revel in it too.
Oh, Tommy loved it. Absolutely adored it. It got him going. And, of course, they then went out and won the game easily. But to this day, I remember thinking to myself, God, this is going to be because I knew enough of how the media worked to know that because I heard Ray Martin, who was the
60 Minutes.
The 60 Minutes guy.
Right.
I heard him turn to one of the cameramen, did you get that? Meaning the scenes. And I thought, oh, here we go.
Gold.
There's gold. Gold from the media, but not for the football team.
Oh,
anyway, of course, it was an enormous, the drama on the following Monday night, which was 24 hours later, because the New South Wales Rugby League, all the delegates met in at Phillip Street. And one by one, delegate after delegate stood up and, how dare this get on our TV screens? This is a disgrace to our great code. Only one club said nothing and sat there, and that was St George, and I never forgot that. So when they made me an offer later, I thought, well, that's a club I want to go to. Yeah. But Manly, of course, they stood up and they said, what a terrible, horrible thing, all our lovely little children in the northern beaches, they're going to be offended by these sites. Well, of course, Les Boyd, at the end of that year, went over to Manly and he played with them, and they came out against us one day and they had blood and gore and everything coming out of their faces. Oh. And I said, Les, what happened in the Manly dressing room? Oh, he said, we did a bit of face slapping.
There you go. There you go. What's good for you is good for us. Unorthodox, let's call it. Yeah. Call it that. Can you imagine that in the NRL dressing rooms these days? I just don't think that would happen. You talk about Manly. So 1980. So you lost, and you've mentioned it already. You lost some very, very good players. Joe Cool goes to Manly.
Ray Brown,
Les and Ray all go to Manly. Tommy goes and joins Singo.
And Graham O'Grady goes as well.
And Graham O'Grady goes to Newtown. These weren't just your footballers. These were very close mates of yours by now, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So there's a lot less loyalty in rugby league these days, right? The golden dollar pretty much dictates everything. But back then, a lot of it was about loyalty, wasn't it?
Well, I can remember Les Boyd called me and he said, will you come over? Judy's cooking a big roast dinner. This is at Strathfield. I lived at Penrith. Bring your family over. He and I went for a long walk before the dinner. My wife and kids were back there at Les's place. We walked and he said, "Okay, Manly have made me a big offer. They're going to, and what do you reckon is the price that I should take from Manly?" Given the fact that West are giving me 25 grand. And I said, well...
And where did that rank back then? Was that sort of top dollar?
No, it was certainly top dollar at West, but it wasn't top dollar anywhere else. No. And I said, mate, if they give you 39, I 39, I don't know why I said 39, but 39, probably 50% on or something. If they offered you that, I wouldn't... No, I said 40. I said round figure 40. And I said, if they give you 40, there's no way in the world I can stop you. You got to go. So I went back to work the next day. I was a teacher out at Doonside High School, and Les rings me. He said, Manly offered me 39. I said, oh, you beauty, you're coming, you're staying. He said, no. I said to him, I want 40. And he said, oh, you got 40. So
there you go.
They all went for 40, Brown. And, of course, Tommy... Tommy and I...
How did Tommy raise it with you that he was heading off?
Well, Tommy rang me up. He said, mate, I was Doonside teaching, and he said it was coming up to 3 o'clock. And he said, Singo wants to meet me in at Phillip Street. Not well. He wants to meet me in the city. So I actually drove him in, parked the car, and I went to the New South Wales Leagues Club to have a beer while he was doing his business with Singo, which was probably in some lawyer's office or somewhere. Yeah. And I thought that he came back with this piece of paper with a contract. It wasn't a formal contract; it was just a written piece of paper, and it's his signature on it and Singo's signature on it. And he said, "I've signed for $50,000."
Not on a beer coaster.
No, a piece of just a standard piece of paper, and $50,000. And I said, "But Tommy, I thought you were just going to take his offer to get more money out of Wests." And he said, "Yeah." I said, "This is a bloody formal contract. You can't get out of this." I know Singo. Singo's going to have all the lawyers in the world.
So he didn't think he was locked in.
Well, he half and half. Well, we then had this massive blue on the floor of the Leagues Club.
Oh, you didn't?
Oh, yeah. Kevin Humphreys, who was the boss of the league, had to come over and pull us apart.
So how old would you have been then? Rough.
79, I would have been 38.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I mean, I was fighting fit.
Yes.
And we were into it. And he was starting to cry, Tommy. That was league back then. Ray Brown, terribly disappointed he left because he'd only been with us 1 year and played for Australia and then went. Joe Cool, Joe Cool had also been there that was about his 7th, 8th year there, so you couldn't really stop him going. But Snake left too, but Snake then came and rejoined me at St George years later.
Yeah. Let's remember Tommy a bit more then, shall we? And no one better to ask than yourself, Roy, because you were so close. So as I said, it is 2 years on since we lost Tommy on the 7th of April. So, and of course, he played number 7.
7th of April, played number 7, died at the age of 70.
This is episode 7 of Behind the Rule.
Yeah, and his wife, Trish, takes great belief in numerology and all of those things.
True? Yeah.
And the seven, there's the 7 C's, the 7 days of the week, the 7 sacraments. There's a lot of magic about the 7.
Some stories we can't tell, clearly. Others we can. And some I don't. A lot of these I don't know. You've given me a few bullet points. Tommy and the broken thumb.
Well, that is an interesting story. That we were going through a bit of. We might have watched a couple of games, but never more than about 3, I think. And we were playing midweek games as well. Now, even though, as I told you, the 60 Minutes people came and reckoned we were on drugs. Well, we could have been if I'd taken notice of Tommy, because he said to me, "Mate, you've got to get us some amphetamines." I said, "What are they?" He said, the pills that make you go better. And I said, well, I did know enough about them to know that they gave you a false sense of your own ability and that they were harmful to the body. And so I went to the club doctor, whose name was Bob McInerney, leading gynaecologist, can you believe, in Sydney. "What are we going to do? Tommy wants amphetamines. We shall give them placebos," he said. Placebos are
sugar tablet or something.
Sugar tablets. Yeah. Well, these were orange-coloured sugar tablets. Well, Tommy took so many that orange froth was coming out of his mouth. Anyway, they all had these sugar tablets, and of course, that were playing Manly. That's why we had to beat Manly at Lidcombe Oval. Well, we're leading 5-0. Tries are worth 3 points in those days. And just before half-time, Terry Randall runs over the top of Tommy. It's 5-all. And I'm furious because one thing I noticed in psychological motivation, etc., that some players can cop a break and some can't. Well, Tommy could cop it. And what's more, when you ripped into Tommy, which rarely I did because he was such a good player, you could see the gelling effect on the rest of the team. God, this is serious. He's ripping into Tommy. We better get ourselves going here. Well, I ripped in. And, of course, then the second half proceeded and we won the match pretty easily. But then he came in and he had a grotesquely broken thumb, and that had happened just before half-time, and that's when he missed Randall. Couldn't grab onto his jumper with his broken thumb. And, of course, I felt bad about it. So off he goes to hospital and has his thumb put in plaster. But he always rang me after big wins And he would ring about 7 o'clock in the morning. He said, mate, that was a great victory. He said, those bloody bombs you gave us, those what do you call them, amphetamines or something.
They did the trick.
He said they did the trick. He said, I haven't been able to sleep a wink all night. He said, watched every movie, cut through a carton of cans, haven't been able to sleep. Anyway, but I've got to tell you this, Chris, you tell a lie and it'll come back to bite you. What do you think happened next week? The players all wanted the bombs again.
Yes.
Well, I had big Bruce Gibbs in the side, the sloth, giant fellow with 3 toes on 1 foot. That's what we called him, the sloth. And Sloth was hopeless in the first half of this particular match. Did absolutely nothing. But he's one bloke you couldn't bake in front of everybody. So I wheeled him around into the toilet area, old toilet area at Lidcombe Oval there. I said, Sloth, what's wrong with you? You haven't made a tackle. You're last of the scrum. You're arguing the referee. Even planes are flying across Lidcombe Oval and you're looking at them. I said, what's the trouble? He said, the bomb hasn't started to work yet.
Take another sugar pill. Oh, dear. On a serious note, as a player, and so I think back, so I was only quite young back then, you know, probably about 10 years of age, and I remember bits and pieces of Tommy, right? What do you remember most about him as a player?
Well, it was his essential toughness. I mean, when you had Tommy, you had 7 backs, but you also had 7 forwards because he played like a forward. He could tackle front on like a forward. He had basically every skill, very much underrated in terms of his skill. He wasn't a good kicker of the ball, but nobody was pretty much back then. But very, very, very tough. I mean, he hated losing. And I talk to modern day players. I talk to my players of my generation. They talk about modern day players, and the one thing they can't cop with modern day players is laughing as they walk off the field.
Yeah, no, and I get that as well. You know, I guess things have changed so much, and opposition teams are all mates away from footy these days. But you're right. You know, if you've been beaten, and even if you've been beaten heavily, it is probably sometimes as a supporter hard to cop seeing them brushing it off because the fans feel it. They put an enormous emotional investment into it. They're paying their money to go in, and here's a bloke on $700,000 lost a game, hasn't made a tackle, walking off with a big grin on his face. Yeah. So I'll tell you a story for your podcast. I wasn't the coach then, I might say, but there were. Tommy was having a shower after a match, and Phil Franks, who was a 5'8", he was in the shower with him. And in the last set, West were beating Canterbury by only a couple of points, and there was only the clock was ticking down right down to time to the end of the match, and Tom passed the ball to Phil, and all Phil really had to do was run at the line. And he passed it to the centre, who Bernie Lowther, a Canterbury, who was an international with New Zealand, intercepted the ball, ran the length of the field, scored between the posts, won the match. And they're having a shower afterwards, and Tommy has a shot at Phil Franks about the intercept pass, and a fight begins under the shower. They're ripping into each other, smacking away at each other under the shower. I mean, that was the passion that people had about losing matches in those days. He was just such a competitive character, wasn't he? And you know, a lovable larrikin. Everyone warmed to him, didn't they?
Yeah.
Did like a shandy or two.
Oh, he did, but he wasn't the massive drinker that Dallas was. No. In fact, on one occasion I said, "The boys, you're drinking far too much. Come on, don't order a beer." This is up at the Railway Hotel. You're not allowed to order a beer after 10 o'clock. Thinking most...
Sort of a Tuesday or a Thursday night after training.
Probably Tuesday, yes. Can't have a beer after 10 o'clock. Can't order a beer after 10 o'clock. Well, what does Dallas do at 1 minute to 10? Orders 3 schooners. He drank till he's old. I remember Tommy walked up, grabbed 2 of the schooners, walked out, and tipped them down in the gutter out the front of the Lidcombe. And Dallas is watching these black suds of beer flow down in the gutter. And he's nearly crying.
Dear, oh dear. In the end, and he was ill for quite some time, wasn't he?
He was. I got a phone call from Trish. She said, "You better come up to see him." So I flew up to from Melbourne to see him, and he was sitting there slumped in a chair, just turned, gave me a beautiful little smile, but then dropped his head and he said, "You got to die sometime." And so the next day we went off to see the doctor, who was his only chance of prolonging his life. So we went in, and the three of us, and we sat down, and the doctor had to make a decision whether to put him on this trial, which was called immunology, which is massively expensive. But, the government will pay for a trial for certain selected people, but you have to be chosen. And he started to ask questions about Tommy's medical history, and every time he asked a question, Trish would say, yes, he's had 300 milligrams of that, he takes them twice a day, any side effects, yes, he's come out with a rash on his big toe. I mean, she just knew everything. So the doctor could quite clearly see he's got a nurse here, he's got somebody that's going to really help the away from the hospital treatment as well. And then he turned, what are you doing? He didn't have a clue who I was. And she said, he was his coach. He's come all the way up from Melbourne. He's worried about him. He's a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald. You could probably see the doctor thinking to himself, well, this is an iconic Australian person. The doctor actually was a fellow of Arabic origin. So but a wonderful, wonderful doctor. They became very close friends. And you could probably see that if the trial was a success, there'd be a little bit of good publicity for his program, and
as it should be. Yeah.
And he agreed to put him on the trial. Now, I remember afterwards sitting down, the pair of us, Trish went off to get the car because he couldn't walk too far, and we sat down together, and it was almost like it was way back in 1978 when we're talking about match plan to beat aside. And we went through the whole interview with the doctor, step by step, answer by answer, because when you're in those pressure situations in front of a doctor, you miss a bit. You miss a bit. The patient does, because I'm going to die, and your mind just can't concentrate. But I was able to, and we went through the whole thing, and we got another 2 years life out of him as a result of that trial.
Wow. And precious years.
2 precious years.
Precious years. His ashes are at Lidcombe, right?
Yes, his ashes are spread there. It was an afternoon, a Saturday afternoon. It was before West Tigers' home game against Melbourne, which would have been the beginning of the 22 season.
Yep.
And Tommy, so the people that went there were Les Boyd, Graham O'Grady, Rick Wade from Wests, my son Sean, and his only son Tommy, who's named after Tommy Raudonikis, and Trish, of course, and of course Tommy's son Lincoln and his wife. So we formed a little circle in the middle of Lidcombe Oval, and we spread the ashes. And as you know, later on this year, the grandstand, the Tommy Raudonikis grandstand, will be officially named in his honour.
Absolutely, yeah, brilliant.
West Tigers members and fans, let's get ready to make some noise at our next home game against Parramatta Eels on Monday the 10th of April. West Tigers have arranged a special ticket offer with free entry for children 15 years and under. Visit West Tigers website for full terms and conditions of this free ticket offer. The Easter Monday showstopper. Come on, show your stripes.
Okay, time now, Roy, a couple of questions from the crowd. And you can do this each week, by the way. The best way to do it is on Instagram. Follow us, like us on Insta. West Tigers BTR is the handle. Just direct message us for the questions for next week. So we've got Paddy Richards and we've got Chrissy Lawrence joining me in next week's edition of Behind the Roar. Maybe another guest too, but that's still to be announced. All right, Roy, we've got a couple have come through here. Carolyn Busfield says, Roy, if you were to do one thing to help these players, that's our West Tigers players now, to help these players play as a unit, what would you do?
I would concentrate on defence. I wouldn't. I would leave the ball on the sideline. I would put the players in various defensive positions, particularly against a State Cup team, and I would drill defence. I'd even break them up into smaller groups, 7 against 6, and situations like that where they had to defend against overlaps. So that what you're trying to do is build trust, Chris. You're trying to build trust where the fellow in the middle of, say, 3 knows precisely what the bloke on the left of him and the bloke on the right of him is going to do. You're not second-guessing what your teammate's going to do. Drill in those defensive drills till it becomes almost automatic to them.
Second question from the crowd, Roy. Thanks for that. Robert Norris, he says, Roy, as a coach, what were your 3 top achievements?
I would say 3 teams for St George in the grand final in '85, West being Western Suburbs Coach of the Century, and I suppose winning the Coach of the Year title 3 times, I suppose, yeah, as opposed to...
That's a handy list of achievements.
Yeah, well...
No.
That great win for the Magpies in that 7... Although 1980 was probably a pretty good year in the sense that we lost all those great players, which we discussed earlier in the podcast, and we turned around with players like Alan Neal and Terry Lamb and Paul Merlot and Bobby Cooper and people that nobody expected to do well, and I think we came in third or third that year.
And see where Barbar kicked on later in his career. One final question from the crowd, but it's me. I mean, I'm sitting in the crowd. I get to do this because I'm in this chair. So much has changed in the game since when you were involved so heavily. We talk about the rules changes. We talk about the more money and the broadcast rights. There's no longer the BIF, a litigious society, the HIA, all that sort of stuff. Is the game as entertaining today, do you think, as it was back then?
I think it is, particularly the use of the wingers. I mean, some of the spectacular tries that they score these days as a result of the taking the corner post out as a part of the field of play. I think it is spectacular, and I don't think that the players are necessarily as good one-on-one defenders as they were in my day, nor do I think that a lot of them can draw and pass and put a bloke through a hole as they did in my day. But overall, they are more skillful. The one thing I would love to see change is making players more committed to the club that they're at and not able to leave 12 months in advance. I mean, I just terribly offended, for example, when Brandon Smith, for example, signed a contract with the Roosters and talking about how he's going to win a competition with the Roosters jumper when he still had 12 months of his to go at the Storm. And that's the one thing that I hate. I know that players will still put in, but it's sending a terrible message when you can sign a contract with another club 12 months while you're still with your existing club.
Well, like you did with Les Boyd, Craig might have said to the Cheese, look, if they give you 899,000, you got to go. But I understand what you're saying. It's just it's a totally different ball game now. But you've just brought back some wonderful memories, Roy, and again, it's been great having a chat with you. Okay, Roy, there's the big clock up there. We're at the SCG, or at Lidcombe, actually. 5 minutes left on the clock. They obviously don't do that anymore, so a rapid fire 5 questions your way. Memories, moments, all that sort of stuff. These are quite tricky too. Don't sit on the fence. Sheensy absolutely sat on the fence. A couple of others have as well. Scando, I think, was a bit on the fence on a couple of them. Question 1, the best player you've ever seen?
Les Boyd.
Bang, straight away. Tell me more why. Yeah, I mean, you have spoken about him.
Well, he had all the skills. I can remember watching a test match between Australia and Great Britain, and it was a deciding test in 1978. I'm sitting in my lounge room. The pommies were... He just picked the ball up, burst through the pommies 2 or 3 times and just won the test on his own. I remember Frank Stanton, who was the coach, the Australian coach, ran out of the field actually and escorted him off the field at half time. He was so impressed with his individual efforts, and Frankie didn't do that too often.
My goodness, you were so quick on that, and you have seen so many.
Well, you know, there's other ones like Michael O'Connor who had all the skills, even Bill Ashurst, who was out at Penrith, who was incredible skills.
What about the modern day players?
Modern day, well, Billy Slater, but I also like Cameron Smith because he could just. No, I've never seen anybody
Here's
control
your
it.
fondness for Melbourne rubbing off on you.
I've never seen anybody control a game like Cameron Smith
No,
could.
true. Your fondest moment in rugby league?
Well, I'll sit on the fence insofar as at West it would probably be being named coach of the century and the West team of the century. That was a massive honour to me. That meant a tremendous amount to me. But at St George, it would be that day that I stood out at the SCG in 1985 and we had 3 teams in the grand final.
Wow.
That was a massive
All
day.
3 grades. Yeah. And you coached 23s at West, didn't you?
I did. We
but
won the
before-
premiership here in 1977. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm breaking away from the favourite 5 here, but just touching, we didn't touch on the Dragons. And you were with some wonderful characters at that club too.
Well, particularly Rocket Reddy, Craig Young, guys like that.
Yeah.
They were. I still have a lot to do with Craig and speak to him regularly because he was. And Rocket, don't see as much of Rocket these days, but he was a great trickster. He was good to have around the club because you never knew what was happening when Rocket was there.
Yeah. Who, in your opinion, Roy, is the best coach the game has ever seen?
I think Jack Gibson, because of the fact that before him, the coaches were sort of ex-players who tell the players to run around the block around the oval a few times, then play a game of touch football. And they were pretty much subservient to selectors as well. There were some great ones, of course, such as Clive Churchill, etc. But they did not have the prominence that they have today until Gibson came along and insisted that a coach be paid $1 more than the highest paid player and pushed them in the direction of being full-time, use of videos. He was also the one that brought out the tractor tyres for them to tackle. He was the one that basically said, listen, defence is equally important to attack in a game, whereas before almost all training was just ball work. He dropped players who were only made 4 tackles. They might have scored 3 tries, but they only made 4 tackles in the forwards, and so they got dropped. He elevated defence.
Yeah, absolutely, Jack. I mean, they were sort of my day, 81, 82, 83, and I remember, Jack out there, and they were training at Granville Park of all places, and Jack was there in his big trench coat, and you're very close with Craig Bellamy of a modern day coaches. He's very astute.
Well, I think and I've seen the evolution of him from about 2004 when he came to the Storm to now. You never get everything with a coach. There's always got to be some little weakness that he has, but I reckon Craig's the total full all-round coach now. He began with technical excellence, making players better skill-wise, but since then he's moved. His strategies and tactics have always been pretty good, but now he's also a very prominent public speaker. He can command $15,000 and speak to the board of BHP. I mean, he's as a man who is probably the greatest technical coach we've ever seen, he's now the full package.
Other than Tommy, the greatest character you've come across in the game?
Well, it'd be Dallas. Dallas because he was just phenomenal both in his ability on the field but also off the field, and so many people gravitated to him. I remember, but he did eat and drink too much. I remember one time outside the Western Suburbs Leagues Club, it was a rainy, pouring night, and the little hot dog boy standing out the front, being sheltered as the rain's pouring down. And I said to the fella, little young bloke, you might as well go home, mate. There's only about 7 people left in the club. And he said, yeah, but one of them's Dallas, and he always buys 5.
A smart boy. Oh, dear. Let's finish on Tommy, Roy. What was your fondest moment together?
The fondest moment we ever had together, it happened frequently when, particularly at the end, when he was very, very ill. And he would sit and he would look at me and a smile would come over his face and he'd say, Roy, they might get a lot more money these days. And then he'd look at me and he'd said, but they'll never, ever, ever have the time we had. And he said that repeatedly, particularly towards the end, as though it was almost comforting him as he slowly slipped in the direction of death.
Wonderful. Yeah. lovely remembering him, and we'll never forget Tommy. He'll always be a huge part of this club, and it's great that stand is being named at Lidcombe Oval. Thank you so much for making the trip up here, Roy. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege chatting to you. So I hope you've enjoyed this edition of Behind the Roar. We will do it again next week, same place, same time. We are doing a live podcast, though, at the game Easter Monday against Parramatta Eels at Accor Stadium for our members, and that will be recorded on the Monday before the game. Let's hope that we are in a good mood after that podcast and after the game. So good luck to the boys on Easter Monday, the next challenge for the West Tigers against Parramatta Eels. But until next time, you know what to do. Show your stripes.
Behind the Roar, the official podcast of West Tigers.